Okay, in this video, we're beginning our series of AUC Section 260 for the auditor's communication with those charged with governance. And this is covered by SAS numbers 122, 123, 125, and 128. And we see here that there have also been a few other SASs that have been issued recently in May and July. And those go into effect for financial statement periods ending December 15, 2020. So that's still a long way away, but they have those SAS sections included in AUC Section 700 and 720 if you want to go take a look at those. But we'll wait a little while before we address those particular SAS numbers. But for now, let's dive into the introduction of AUC Section 260. So this whole Section 260 is going to be about our responsibility to communicate with those charged with governance and an audit of financial statements. And already in several sections up until now, we've seen that we've got a lot of responsibilities for communicating with those charged with governance in various ways. So we have to comply with those other AUC sections that address this, and also with this AUC section, which addresses communication with those charged with governance more directly. And so this only applies to our communications with those charged with governance and not to communications with the entity's management. But in some cases, the entity's management has governance roles, and so we have specific requirements for those situations. And so before we get too deep into this, it might be a good idea for us to look at the definitions of what is management and what is those charged with governance. And they have those definitions here. It says that management is a person with executive responsibility for the conduct of the entity's operations. However, for some entities, management includes some or all of those charged with governance. So, for example, executive members of a governance board or an owner management, or owner manager. So, let's say the owner of the company is also the president or CEO and directs the day-to-day operations of the entity. Then that owner manager has qualities of both a manager and of those charged with governance. And the same applies if, for instance, the CEO sits on the board of directors. Then he has a role of both management and those charged with governance. So those charged with governance would be persons of the organization that have responsibility for overseeing the strategic direction of the entity and obligations related to the accountability of the entity. So this includes overseeing the financial reporting process, which is what we're principally concerned with. And so those charged with governance may include management personnel, as we just discussed, for example, executive members of a governance board or an owner manager. So we mention that because this section, even though it says that responsibilities for us to communicate to those charged with governance could include owner managers because they are the ones that are charged with governance. So in addition to that, this section is written in the context of an audit of financial statements, but it could also be applied or adapted as necessary to the audit of other historical financial information when those charged with governance have a responsibility to oversee the preparation and fair presentation of that historical financial information. So even though it might not be financial statement per se, if those charged with governance have the responsibility for overseeing that information, we might still have to communicate with them. And the overarching goal here, as we see, is that it's very important for an effective two-way communication in the audit of the financial statements with those charged with governance. And so we should set that precedent at the outset. As we mentioned at the beginning of this video, there are additional matters to communicate to those charged with governance that are referenced in other AUC sections. And we'll get down to the exhibit requirements to communicate with those charged with governance in other AUC sections. And so we can go to that section a little later if we want to. But as we mentioned, there are other AUC sections that address our responsibilities to communicate with those charged with governance, and this exhibit explains a few of those situations, and we will see those in other videos as well when we're going through the other AUC sections. But in addition, we have AUC Section 265, which will be in our next video series. But in that instance, they tell us how to communicate internal control related matters that are identified in the audit. And so that is in addition to the communications that we're required to perform as part of this AUC Section 260. And also, we may be required to communicate with those charged with governance or management in accordance with external requirements, and we would have to follow those requirements as well. So nothing in this section is going to tell us that we cannot communicate some certain piece of information. So anything that we feel is necessary for those charged with governance to know in order for them to fulfill their responsibility for the oversight of the entity, then we should communicate with them. So all of the requirements in this section are a minimum, not a maximum. And so this went into effect for financial statement periods ending on or after December 15, 2012. So it's been in place for a pretty long time. And our objectives for fulfilling these requirements and what we're trying to achieve by fulfilling all of the requirements are that we want to communicate clearly with those charged with governance and responsibilities that we have regarding the financial statement audit and an overview of the plan, scope, and timing of the audit. And that most often is included in our engagement letter that we would have someone at those charged with governance sign, possibly. We also want to obtain from those charged with governance information relevant to the audit. We also want to provide those charged with governance with timely observations arising from the audit that are significant and relevant to their responsibility to oversee the financial reporting process. and we also want to promote effective two-way communication between us and those charged with governance. So this two-way communication would certainly help to fulfill all of these other objectives. And so in the next videos, we'll start going through the requirements, but in the meantime, let's take a look at this explanatory material at sections A1 through A5. Okay, so here we're down in the explanatory material, and we're further discussing the scope of what we're trying to accomplish when we communicate with those charged with governance. And first it says the role of the communication. It says that this AUC section 260 focuses primarily on communications with us, between us and those charged with governance, or rather from us to those charged with governance. However, we sort of want to achieve a two-way communication. That way we can understand matters related to the audit in context and develop a good working relationship with those charged with governance. But we also need to maintain our independence and objectivity. So it's an interesting line that we have to walk there. Also, the two-way communication might help us to obtain from those charged with governance information that's relevant to the audit. And also, by our communications to them about the audit, it would help them to fulfill their responsibility for overseeing the financial reporting process. And you might could think of that as a way of reducing risk and material misstatement of the financial statements if we keep those charged with governance more involved. And so even though this section gives us some specific responsibilities for communicating with those charged with governance, management also has that responsibility. And of course, this AUC section doesn't direct management to do anything, but we want to acknowledge here that just because we communicate with those charged with governance regarding the audit and all of that, that doesn't relieve management of its responsibility to communicate with those charged with governance as well. And on the other side of the coin, management's communication with those charged with governance does not relieve us of our responsibility to communicate with those charged with governance as well. So those charged with governance might be hearing the same information from both of us, and that might alter our form or timing of our communication. For instance, if we know governance already knows about a particular topic, we may not have to explain too deeply about it, but we still need to communicate nonetheless. So in addition, clear communication of specific matters is required by GAS and this AUC section, as well as others, as an integral part of the audit, but we're not required to perform other procedures specifically to identify other significant matters that we would need to communicate to those charged with governance. So we need to comply with the requirements in these sections about communicating to those charged with governance, but we don't necessarily have to do anything beyond that. And finally, as it relates to legal or regulatory restrictions on communicating with those charged with governance, the law or regulation might restrict our communication of certain matters with those charged with governance. For example, the law or regulation might specifically prohibit a communication that might prejudice an investigation. And of course, there might be a conflict between our obligation of confidentiality as well as our obligation to communicate with those charged with governance, and that could certainly be complex and maybe more of a legal matter that we need to consult with legal counsel about. And finally, in certain situations, we might be required to report to a regulatory or enforcement body certain matters that have been communicated to those charged with governance, and that's part of government auditing standards to report fraud, illegal acts, violations, or provisions of contracts or grant agreements and abuse directly to such parties in certain circumstances. So we need to be aware of those particular requirements as well.